Shalom, everyone. Dr. Dinah Dye here. Welcome to this presentation on Passover. I've called it A New Moses, A New Passover, and A New Exodus. This will be part one. And so this will focus a little bit differently than on the second part. We're going to try to unpack some of what Yeshua is saying and what he's doing in the New Testament with regards to Passover. So it appears from our reading that the prophets foretold of a new Exodus, the coming of a new Moses, the making of a new covenant we see in Jeremiah, the building of a new temple, and ultimately journeying to a new promised land. So what does that even mean? They obviously had an idea of what it meant for them, but what does it mean for us today? So hopefully by the time we get through this teaching, that'll make sense. So a lot of what Israel's had to deal with throughout her history was exile. And so the goal of the new Exodus, and ultimately, obviously, the first Exodus, the reversal of their exile from Egypt, and now a new Exodus, a reversal of their exile. Of course, by that time, first century, they've been half a millennia, most of them in exile. So this is kind of a big deal. And so this new Exodus language we're going to see permeates the New Testament. Obviously, I don't have time to go into everything. I've kind of picked out some what I think are important narratives in regards to this subject. But the idea of a new Exodus by the time we get to the first century was very widespread. And so Yeshua's words, his actions, pointed to this long-awaited new Exodus. And again, this new Exodus basically pointed to his death, his burial, and ultimately his resurrection. Now, what's in the New Testament is obviously not identical to the story that we have of the Exodus in the book of Exodus, but there's always these references, these allusions, these sort of pointing, this echoing. And so it was designed to remind the hearers of Yeshua, the hearers of the word, to recall and to remember what God did. But I think there's even more than that in this. And so, when we celebrate the Passover, we are doing a rehearsal, a remembrance, a memorial. But why? Why? And hopefully I can try to answer that. Needless to say, as I mentioned, the New Testament Exodus references are innumerable. It's a giant topic. There have been many scholars written great work on this. So clearly I can't, with this amount of time, go into it, but hopefully give you enough so that you can build on your own studies. One of my premises in all of this is that, John 6 is all about the Passover, and we will talk about that. But I began to wonder if there was a correlation between John 6 and Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, 5-7 there. And so I'm going to present that. Am I 100% correct? I don't know. But it looked to me that there was that the Sermon on the Mount, which I know many of you already know this, looks a replay of Moses on the mountain receiving the tablets of stone. And now we have Yeshua on a mountain, and he's giving us a close look into the wisdom of the Torah. So there's lots there. Again, there's lots of Exodus language in the stories that Yeshua presents us with. We have mountains, him going to the top of mountains. We see him in the wilderness. We have him walking on the seas. John 6 talks about the manna. We have the bread of the presence in the tabernacle, also in John 6 as a reference back to Exodus. So there's a great deal of it. So I want to give you a quick overview here right now, and you can take this wherever you want it. It's kind of a very large topic, but for our purposes in the second part, we're going to focus more on the new manna and the new bread of the presence. But you think about it, we have a new Moses, Yeshua following in the footsteps of Moses as Redeemer, mediator, and who calls himself the I Am, the great I Am, in reference to the name that God told Moses to use when he went to Egypt. We have a new Passover, what we call the Last Supper, called communion, the last Passover, where they're eating the lamb and eating the bread and drinking the wine. So this is definitely a meal, and food is being eaten, and we'll talk about that as well. We have in the New Testament the new leadership. We have the 12 disciples. Originally, of course, we have the 12 tribes, which turned into the Commonwealth of Israel. And now we have 12 disciples, which are in essence, going to turn into multitudes of people over time. We have a new tabernacle. We had the wilderness structure in the obviously in the wilderness, and now Yeshua keeps referring to his body as a temple or a tabernacle. We see that in John chapter 1, that the word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. So that's another reference to that. We have a new Sinai mountain. So clearly Moses is on the mountain, Mount Sinai in the wilderness. And then when we get to the New Testament, as I mentioned, we have the Sermon on the Mountain, and we have John 6 taking place on a mountain, both in the same location, Capernaum, Capharnaum. And we could argue there may be references in there to Mount Zion, obviously where the temple is. We have a new promised land. Of course, anciently, we had Israel finally crossing over the Jordan River, and now we move into the new kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And so there's that language of promised land. We have a new covenant. So anytime you make a covenant with someone, there needs to be a meal to ratify, establish, and seal that covenant. So the covenant is often sealed through bread and wine. And we see in Exodus, the new covenant in my blood. So there's echoes there of what Yeshua is saying. You can find that Exodus 24:8. So the blood of the covenant. We have the new manna, the unleavened bread, which signifies the body of Messiah, again in John 6. And we have the bread of the presence, which again we'll talk about. We have the new cup, or the last cup, the fourth cup, what's called the cup of completion, which is drunk at the crucifixion, in a manner of speaking. And we have, ultimately, this is all pointing to the new Exodus. So the death, the burial, the resurrection, the ascension. And so this idea of being, instead of being rescued from Egypt or rescued from Babylon or rescued from Assyria or Persia or Rome or whatever, now we have the new Exodus as being rescued from death. So again, that's quite a bit, just some information. Maybe you want to build on that. So we could ask, what is the ultimate purpose of the Exodus? And then by extension, the new Exodus. And we could say freedom, deliverance, setting the captives free from tyranny, all of that sort of thing. Freedom from what, we might ask. And so we would go back, you've read in Romans about the creation being held captive, if you will. So we go back to the idea of creation, and I've heard various scholars, Morales is one, would say that the telos, or the goal of creation, is worship. So I think really the freedom to worship, because when you're held captive and you're under tyrannical rule, you can't just do what you want, when you want, where you want, how you want. There's a protocol the government institutes, and you're kind of held captive by that. So this telos of creation, this idea of worship, everything moving towards worship. And I would say the same would be for the new creation, to setting the captives free in the same way that creation was set free, in order for all of creation to worship him. I think that's really the bottom line for the whole Passover environment. And yes, it's important that we rehearse and we remember and we go, so those of you who go through the Passovers in your home. But what is the greater message? What is it all leading to? And I would just say worship. It's all about being set free to worship. And worship basically being defined as dwelling in the divine presence. So if there's no divine presence, you're not dwelling in. So that's the whole point of getting them out of exile and back to the place where the divine presence would rest, in order for them to worship. And worship comes in a multitude of ways, certainly through liturgy and action and work and service, and the whole temple structure with all of the work that went on by the priests. It's been said that the highest form of worship is eating, which I find fascinating. And so if we think of it in those terms of, especially with the Passover meal, that this idea of worshiping through eating, and in the temple, there's a lot of eating that went on. The burnt offering, for example, was God's food, Yahweh's food, when it was offered up. But the priests were eating, the various offerings, etc. the folks were eating, especially when we get to the first century, with the synagogue and their home. And then, of course, they go up to the temple or like Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, and they'd be eating, and Passover, they'd be eating. So in essence, they're eating the Passover, they're eating unleavened bread, they're eating the bread of the presence, they're drinking wine. These, I think, need to be seen in terms of acts of worship. I think of that scripture, taste and see that the Lord is good, and perhaps Yeshua referring to that. So in some respects, eating is a confirmation of the restoration into the presence of God. It's kind of a mouthful there. But worship and the sacrifices and the celebration of the festivals and the work and service in the sanctuary, all of these things are connected. And the Passover lamb offering was the thing that led them out of Egypt into the wilderness and ultimately to Mount Sinai. It was like an entire event that took a bit of time. And so part of the eating signified the removal from exile. Now, exile, as we mentioned, is the place, the separation from God himself, being removed from his presence, from his divine presence, signified kind of a descent, if you will, a death experience, versus the Exodus, which signified an ascent, a life experience. So, when they came out of Egypt, they always talk about going down to Egypt. So leaving Egypt spoke of ascending, and ultimately they're going to ascend the mountain, Moses and elders and company ascending the mountain. So the Exodus ultimately is going to push towards returning to the promised land. It was all about getting back to the promised land that they had once been in. Of course, the family, Abraham and family, went down to Egypt, and Jacob and family went down to Egypt. There was a lot of going down to Egypt. But ultimately, the return to the promised land is what's important here. And of course, if you get to the land and work the land, and the land is good, and the land is fertile and fruitful and prosperous, they're going to cultivate the land just like it's a garden. The earth is functioning as a garden here so that they can produce an abundant amount of food, which is life. Food is life-giving. I mean, obviously you don't eat, you die. And so in the ancient world, they didn't have a refrigeration, and they didn't go to the grocery store to store up their food. So they were good for weeks and months and store, prepping. So all is well. It's what they grew is what they ate. And if they didn't grow, and if the land couldn't produce, and if there were storms and locust plagues and what have you, then they didn't eat. So this ritual movement from exile to Exodus, from death to life, was connected to, very much in a real sense, in a practical way, connected to eating. So it was an important goal around the Passover, is not just, again, to remember it, but to worship Yahweh through eating the lamb. And in eating the lamb, receiving that new creation life. Again, I think this has something to do with the telos of creation, the worship, the goal of creation to worship, and eating had a component in that. So as they leave Egypt, they of course are in captivity. They will be delivered through the sea into the wilderness, into the mountain sanctuary. That's sort of the design here. And the central plot of the book of Exodus is this divine movement. And ultimately, when we get to the end of Exodus, we're moving from this mountain imagery to the tent, to the tabernacle, and all sort of culminates there. So the completed building project at the time, which is going to be the tabernacle, is this proclamation of Yahweh's cosmic rule. And not an aside, but as part of that, a component of that, is the incarnation of the triumphant king amidst his people. And so Yahweh would take his place in the tabernacle. And then, of course, we know it was a tabernacle that was on the move. It was mobile. And so the presence of God is moving with the children of Israel. I liked this quote by A.C. Later. He said, "The tabernacle mediating paradise to the exiled descendants of Adam." So this is how the tabernacle functioned. It mediated paradise to those to the exiled descendants. Of course, in this case, these are the ones exiled from Egypt. And the same will be true with the temple by the time we return back to the land of Israel and coming into the first century. True freedom is a life of worship where Yahweh is in the midst of his people. Again, true freedom is a life of worship, and not worship just singing songs, but worship in every aspect of your life, everything you do and everything you say and everything you bring, the entire protocol of coming into his presence, speaking of Yahweh being in the midst of his presence. So my thesis, as I mentioned, was that there is a correlation of Passover between Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, starting in 5, although I want to go back and look at a few narratives in 3 and 4. And it connects to, in my opinion, John chapter 6, the Passover, what I call the Passover chapter. And so we're going to see these echoes in these narratives of events in the Exodus story. Again, they're not exact. And hopefully this will help us better understand this idea of the new Passover and the new Exodus. I think the biggest challenge in that is, okay, this is nice. We're celebrating this. Yes, we're recognizing Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. We're remembering, we're honoring. But what does it really mean in the New Testament? And what does that really mean for us? So let's go back, and I would suggest you reread some of these passages. It's in Exodus 34. It tells us that Moses rose early in the morning, and he went up on Mount Sinai. And at that time, Adonai, God, Yahweh, descended in a cloud and stood with him there as he called on the name of the Lord. And Adonai is telling him, I am cutting a covenant with you. And he is doing this, he's saying, before all the people. So all the people that were there, he is going to do this awesome thing, wonders that have never been done or not done on the earth or in any nation. And so then all the people that you are among will see the work of Adonai in your midst. And within that chapter, Exodus 34, he does talk about not eating the sacrifices of enemies who are in the land, and lists off all the ites that are in the land. And they are called on to break those altars. You see, eating and food and how it's offered and worship, all of that is a big deal. And within this chapter 34 also tells them to keep the Passover, the Feast of Matzot is how it's described, 7 days in the month of Aviv, of course the first month when they came out of Egypt in the spring. And the Lord says to them, do not offer the blood of my sacrifice with chametz, or with leaven. And that, I thought, just as an aside, interestingly enough, that the sacrifice of the Passover should not remain until morning. And of course, when we see in the New Testament, the body of Yeshua was not allowed to stay up on the cross, on the crucifixion stake, until the next morning. And you can read that in John 19, and there's also a reference in John 12. Now, this is what I want you to focus on, because it says that Moses stayed with Adonai 40 days and 40 nights and did not eat bread or drink water. And when Moses came down off the mountain, it says the skin of his face shone in rays. Israel was fairly concerned about that. They had fear, but they finally came near. And it says he gave them mitzvot, or commandments, the Torah commandments. Now, if we go over to Matthew 5:1, it tells us that Yeshua saw the crowd. So there was a great multitude that had appeared. And up until that time, Yeshua had been going through the Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news. The good news being there's a new king and there's a new kingdom here. And then we see following all that are these healings, or we could say these great wonders that have never been seen amongst the people and in the nation before, like we had there in Exodus 34, not done in all the earth. And the folks are the sick, and they're tormented with diseases and afflictions, and they're plagued by demons, and they're epileptics, and they're paralyzed, and he heals them. And so these large crowds continue to gather, especially beyond the Jordan. So in John chapter 6, it tells us that Yeshua went to the other side of the Galilee, the same kind of location here, And large crowds began following him there. And these crowds were watching for these signs that he was performing on the sick. So very similar to what we had here in Matthew 5. Now, it also tells us in Matthew 5, verse 1, that he went up, he ascended the mountain, and after he sat. Now, he sat with his disciples, the disciples who were the 12, who were to represent the 12 tribes. And they came to him, and it says he opened his mouth and he began to teach, which reminds me of going back to the mitzvot that he gave on the 2 tablets of stone, which is all part of the Exodus 24-34 story as well. And so the disciples sort of function in the same way that the elders had when they ascended the mountain partway up with Moses. And in John 6, it tells us very clearly that the Passover, the Jewish feast, was near. And the question was, where will we buy bread so that we may eat? So there's this potential here for hunger and thirst. Back to Exodus 24, you can read this in 9 through 11, but that's where we see Moses, Aaron, the sons of Aaron, and the 70 elders who go up, who ascend. And it says that they saw God, and under his feet they saw a sapphire pavement, clear as the heavens. And it says he did not raise his hands against the nobles, so they beheld God, and they ate and they drank. So in this very momentous time where they ascend the mountain, they are going to eat and drink as an act of worship. Now, Moses, of course, alone was the one permitted to ascend to the summit of Mount Sinai. And he can represent the king, the high priest, all this. As a righteous man, he is ascending to the summit of Yahweh's mountain. And typically what you have in the ancient world when someone notable as Moses is ascending, that indicates to us some sort of king coronation, installation of some kind on the mountain, this ritual ascent. And part of the ancient Near East world, when they saw an ascent of a man, it was said when he took his seat on the throne on top of the mountain, he was transformed into a divine being as he ascended, quote unquote, into heaven, because the top of the mountain represented heaven. And as the royal candidate, he would sit on the throne in the place where a temple would normally be. And when he sat, it was said that he was transformed from a human into a god. So we've seen already that Yeshua went up on the mountain in both Matthew 5:1 and in John 6. He ascended the mountain and he sat. I don't think that's an accident. I think it's trying to get us back to what's going on in the Exodus story. So if we back up again, Matthew 4, verse 1, it tells us, and you're familiar with this, Yeshua was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, tested by the devil or the adversary. And after he fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And we have the same expression in Exodus 34. Moses stayed with Adonai 40 days and 40 nights, and he did not eat bread. And again, I mentioned at that point, Moses would write on the tablets the words of the covenant, and his face shone like the rays. And so the adversaries to Yeshua, who are out in the wilderness, think of the sort of battle between Pharaoh and Moses, and now we have Yeshua and the adversary who's functioning much of the same way. If you are Ben Elohim, if you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. And then Yeshua's response, of course, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So we have this eating of bread. Back to John 6:31, our fathers ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, out of heaven he gave them bread to eat. And then further on in John, Yeshua will say, for the bread of God is the one coming down from heaven and giving life to the world. I am, there's our I am expression, the bread of life, like we heard in Exodus 3:14. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. This is the bread of my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. So I think we have two things going on here. We have the manna, and we also have the bread of the presence. And that whole episode in Matthew 4 goes on. And of course, the adversary threatens him with the holy city being on the highest point of the temple, and then they're going to a very high mountain. You see all this mountain language and being at a very high place. Speaking of world governments, the kingdoms of this world and their glory, because their power base is always going to be mountains. And what is the response? Worship me. And that's what the adversary is calling Yeshua to do. And of course, Yeshua responds with the word of God, the oracle of God. It is written, the tablets of stone, back to what we have back in Exodus. So he goes on to say that Yeshua tells the adversary to go away. That's kind of how it's expressed. And so the word there for to go away or to, some of it says resist, but it's really the idea of driving him back. The Hebrew word there is yalak, to drive him back, which happens to be the same word that we have in Exodus 14:21, when Moses stretched his hand out over the sea to drive back the sea. And of course, the seas were associated with the nations and the bad guys, etc. So this driving back, it's yalak, and not so much the way we see it as resist. It tells us in Exodus 14 that Adonai drove back the sea with a strong east wind, a ruach, throughout the night. And that east wind was going to allow the dry ground to appear. And we see that the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, following all of this. So we have a lot of that language of the nations, or the picture of Pharaoh and the adversary, etc. And so in Matthew 4, it says, worship Adonai and only him, speaking of Yeshua, and he is telling the adversary to go away. He drove him back is the better translation. And so John 6:16, we have in the evening, Yeshua's disciples, kind of picture of the tribes, went down to the sea. They got in the boat. It was dark. And then we have again, a great wind, a ruach, began to stir up the sea. And the boat was kind of the imagery of the dry ground, the place of safety and security in the midst of the sea. And of course, then what do they see? Yeshua appeared walking on the water, taking control over the sea. And in that, I thought it was interesting because he says, I am. Don't be afraid. I am. The ego eimi in the Greek. And so the similar expression that we have in Exodus 3:14, I am. I will be who I will be. I will surely be with you. And this is the sign that I sent you to rescue the children of Israel from Egypt. And you will worship God on this mountain because I am, speaking of Yahweh, has sent me to you, and Moses being on the receiving end of the name. And so Yeshua is reminding us within this story in John chapter 6 at the Passover that he is indeed the great I am, the one who will deliver at the mountain. So in Exodus 14:15, it says, stretch out your hand over the sea so the waters will come over the Egyptians. And Adonai threw them into the sea and the waters covered them. And you know all that story. And Israel walked on this on dry ground in the midst of the seas. And so we have this immersion language going on. Israel being immersed in the seas, this sort of death to life, birth, renewal thing, while the Egyptians are sinking down into the sea. Israel's coming up out of the sea to new life. And so we have the same kind of picture in Matthew 3:13, leading up to the Sermon on the Mount. Again, this is chapter 3, where Yeshua came to be immersed in the Jordan. He rose up out of the water. The heavens opened. He saw the Ruach Elohim descending on him. And that voice from heaven, this is my beloved Son in whom I love, and him I am well pleased. Again, this is kingship language that he will later. This is part of the coronation ceremony, coming up new life out of water. So we have similarities there as well. When the children of Israel entered into the water, it's as though they died, but then they emerged and they were reborn. And so the enthronement is a process that begins at the sea and not so much at the mountain, although its completion will take place at the mountain. The enthronement will take place fully at the mountain, and you can read about that in Matthew 19. So all these waters of creation and rebirth and these separation elements are designed to take us back to Genesis chapter 1. And we find that separation, signifies an act of creation. And so we see that all of this separation kind of language talks about the rebellious waters, the seas being conquered. And so Yahweh's control of the sea is a dominant theme. It's a creation theme. It's an Israel birth theme. And this act of creation is the first act of worship. Again, worshiping God, defeating the enemy in Matthew 4, the ascent to the summit. All of these are speaking of creation ideas and the idea of worship. So the sort of theme that we see, the exile, the departure from Egypt, through the waters, through the seas, into the wilderness, and ultimately to the sanctuary. The tabernacle will be in that case. And then we see Yeshua doing a similar thing. He is immersed in the water. He meets the adversary in the wilderness, and then he ascends the mountain in Matthew 5:1. And he ascends the mountain, and as he ascended, he opened his mouth and began to teach. So we'll go more into the bread and the bread of the presence and the manna in the second part. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I will see you in part 2.